Sue, for that statement. I think thinking about a world beyond ourselves and an empathy for the shared humanity of those around the planet experiencing sometimes extraordinary situations, that type of empathy represents the best of Derryfield. So thank you to Apexu for speaking with us this morning about what the earthquake that has happened in Turkey and Syria and in that region. We find ourselves in the thick of winter, often daydreaming about warm days to come this spring and this summer. And we should take a moment and pause and ask ourselves about what winter has to teach us. We're lucky to be joined this morning by Anders Morley, a Nordic athlete and skier and rider who had the experience of skiing across large parts of northern Canada in the winter. And he's written a book about this called This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter. Mr. Morley, who will be speaking to us about his experiences and the central theme of winter and the environment, has worked as a translator and teacher in Italy, a tree planter in Saskatchewan, and a forester's assistant in British Columbia. He holds a degree in ancient history from the University of St. Andrews and has studied history and modern languages at Columbia University and Edinburgh University. Mr. Morley, perhaps most importantly for us in this moment as we think about him, he attended Derryfield in the 7th grade. Can give him a round of applause, kind of a homecoming for him. Now, Mr. Morley, before I welcome you to the stage, I was reading his book last night and thinking about some of the key ideas in it, and I want to read a paragraph which speaks to some of these themes before I turn the stage over to him. I also want to emphasize that Mr. Morley will be sticking around for lunch today. We have a couple pizzas coming in room 209, 210. Some of you have RSVP'd to this. If you would like to join us, whether you have pizza or not, if you just want to come and speak with Mr. Morley about his experiences, please come to room 209, 210 at lunchtime, and you might just get a slice of pizza as well. Mr. Morley has written, quote, "When you go into nature's spaces by yourself, and it doesn't have to be a great wilderness, your ego can melt away as you become absorbed in minuscule facets of the world that in company you might never have noticed. An intimacy with winter makes it sometimes unsettlingly apparent that nature is not some volitional force that cares whether we live or die. Caring is what humans do. It's why we make homes, our little refuges in the wilderness, and trails that lead us back to those homes, where we find other people who care for us and need our caring in return. It is this that holds the human center and gives life, that wonderful oxygenating of the coursing blood, the soft, warm glow we call meaning." Mr. Morley.
It's good to be back at Derryfield. As was mentioned in the introduction, I spent a year here in 7th grade, and it was actually one of the happiest years in all of my school years, so it's nice to be back. I don't have a lot of time, and I have a fairly involved and epic story to tell, so it's going to be, it may feel a little bit rushed, but I'm glad you read that quotation from near the end of the book, because that's kind of the moral of this story. I was this person that set off on this journey alone, in a way trying to get away from the world, and I ended up coming back to it and kind of embracing the importance of human connection. I want to show some slides, but before I get into the pictures and the story, I want you to just sort of pair off with your neighbor for 30 seconds or a minute and think about some of these questions. I want you to think of the hardest thing that you've ever done just because it was important to you and not something that someone else was telling you that you had to do. A challenge that you set for yourself. And think about these questions. Did the experience go the way you expected it to? Did it teach you something about the world? And what did you learn about yourself through this experience? So just turn to your neighbor for 30 seconds. We don't have a lot of time, and think about these questions. All right. I hope you had some interesting conversations. Well, my decision to go on this journey probably obviously was entirely voluntary. It was something that I decided to do myself, but it is also the hardest thing that I've ever done. So it's kind of interesting to think about why we choose to do things that are hard. And sometimes these decisions take us in very unexpected directions, and that was certainly the case here, and that's one of the themes that I explore in the book. Sometimes we have these dreams, these visions, these challenges we set for ourselves, and we have this feeling that we have to do these things for some reason. We don't exactly know why. Maybe we think we know why, but in the end, it turns out to be something entirely different. My journey started in a way when I was living in Italy. I was living in this city here called Bergamo in northern Italy at the foot of the Alps. I don't have time to go into the reasons why, but I was married to an Italian woman whom I had met in graduate school, and I lived there for close to a decade. But after 7 or 8 years there, I started to experience this kind of nagging sense of unease that people experience sometimes in their lives. And I wasn't sure exactly what it was. I knew that homesickness was part of it. I grew up in New Hampshire. I've always loved New Hampshire. I loved kind of the quiet and open spaces of northern New England. And here I was living in this busy city and kind of feeling a little homesick. And one day while I was walking home from work, I walked past a newsstand and I saw a copy of a National Geographic magazine. And since I like to read it sometimes, I grabbed it, brought it home. And when I got home, I opened it up. And what I saw looking back at me was this picture. I didn't know exactly what it was. I hadn't read the caption or anything. But something about the picture seemed, for some reason, to cry out to me, this is what you need to be doing right now. This is the medicine for this sense of unease you're experiencing. Now, I had for a long time dreamt of going on some sort of a long, self-propelled journey. I'd expected maybe it would be the Appalachian Trail sometime before I got too old. But when I saw this picture, I had a different idea. I'd been skiing since I was 5 years old, first downhill skiing, and then I later discovered cross-country skiing. And I'd been on lots of adventures in New Hampshire. I'd skied down Tuckerman Ravine when I was 13 years old, and I tell some stories about that in the book as well. So suddenly I had all these sort of memories from childhood skiing rushed back into my head, and this idea of going on a long journey and the skiing sort of came together, and I had this idea of going on a long journey across winter and using it as kind of an opportunity to learn something new, to learn this unfamiliar geography of northern Canada, which I quickly decided would be the place I would go because I needed a place where winters were long and snowy. And it might be a chance for me to start doing something with my life, because at the time I was working a couple of jobs that were okay, but not particularly satisfying to me. And I had long dreamt of writing, and this seemed like a concrete project, something I could take on and I could spend a lot of time writing about. And so the project kind of grew in my head, and I started spending a lot of time up in the nearby Alps the following winter, kind of going on weekend trips, practicing for for this much bigger journey that I planned to take. I also spent a lot of time reading about other people who had explored in the wintertime, and one of the most famous of those people was Fridtjof Nansen, who we see on the screen here. Now, Nansen is a name you may have heard before. He was a Norwegian explorer, quite prominent in the late 19th century. And Nansen is best remembered today for being the first person to cross the Greenland ice cap and to demonstrate that Greenland was in fact covered with an ice cap, which was not known at the time. And later, he came closer than anyone had until that time to the North Pole. But there were a couple of, Nansen had been kind of a hero of mine for a long time, and there were a couple of stories that really stuck with me about Nansen. One of them was when he was in his student days. His family came from Oslo in southeastern Norway, but he went to university on the west coast of Norway, about 200 miles away. Well, one year, when the winter holidays came around and all of Nansen's friends from Oslo were getting on the trains to head back home to see their families, Nansen decided, kind of on a whim, that he didn't want to take the train, and so he grabbed his skis, grabbed a backpack, stuffed all his stuff in it, and headed off to ski 200 miles home over the mountains just to see his family for a couple weeks of vacation. Kind of like if we were to put our skis on here in Manchester and ski to Montreal, between now and the end of this assembly, just because the thought crossed our mind. But there was something about kind of the merging of the epic and the everyday in this story that appealed to me. And Nansen's doing this kind of thing over and over throughout his life. And that was kind of the spirit that I wanted my journey to be in. Another Nansen story comes from his crossing of Greenland, which took place in the late 1880s. He had this idea of crossing Greenland and presented it to some people and talked to scientists about it. And everyone suggested that he start on the west coast, the North American side of Greenland, because that's where all the settlements were. And so he could kind of outfit in one of these towns and head into Greenland, and then if he needed to go back, he would have an easy way out. But Nansen said, "I have thought that the much-praised line of retreat is a snare for people who wish to reach their goal." So this is kind of an expression of his dedication. He didn't want to have a way out. So what Nansen did was he hired a boat to take him around to the east coast, to the basically uninhabited east coast of Greenland, which is hemmed in by all the sea ice that you have, like a belt of sea ice that's tens of miles wide that you have to get across. So Nansen had the ship drop him and his crew off on an ice floe with some sleds, skis, and rowboats. And then they just hauled their stuff across these ice floes and then rowed between them and on like that for tens of miles until they got to the mainland. And of course, at this point, there was no way of knowing where they were. There was no way of going back. And so they were completely committed to the journey. Now, sometimes when we decide to do big things, that's kind of the attitude we have to take. And it seems reckless sometimes, and sometimes it is. But I think that sometimes it's necessary. Anyway, that was kind of my attitude at the time, for better or worse. And there's a bit of both, as I talk about in the book. So my plan was to ski from west to east across Canada. So I headed out to Vancouver, British Columbia, on the west coast of Canada, and then took a boat up the long west coast, up what's known as the Inside Passage, towards Alaska. This is what it looks like. It's kind of rainy and gray and dreary much of the way. And my plan was to start in a town called Prince Rupert, which has a reputation for being rainy and gray, as I said a moment ago. But as we were coming into port, the clouds parted, and it became kind of a sunny day, which to me seemed like a good omen. Now, my plan, as I said, was to head from west to east. Prince Rupert is up here. And initially, I thought I would be able to ski all the way across Canada. But after just about 3 weeks on the trail, it became apparent to me that at the rate I was going, there was no way I was going to ski 4,000 miles across Canada. And so what you see in this map, which is in the book, is the journey that I actually ended up making over the course of the 4 winter months that I spent out in Canada. After just a few days on the trail, so where I started in Prince Rupert, it's kind of this mild northwestern climate. It doesn't really snow there. And so for the first part, I had to walk inland, carrying a lot of the stuff that I would later be hauling in a sled. And hauling things in a sled is much easier. But this experience of walking while carrying all this weight convinced me that I was carrying far too much with me. And so at a certain point, I checked into a motel and spent a couple of days carefully thinking about everything I had with me and sort of purging, getting rid of all the excess that I could. And then I headed into the mountains. My first objective was to cross what are called the Coast Mountains. This is a western mountain range in Canada. It's just the northern extension of what we call the Cascade Range in the US. And this is what it looked like. So I skied up into the mountains very gradually at first. And sometimes there would be things like snowmobile trails that would make the going a little bit easier. At other times, I was breaking my own trail. After a couple of days up into the mountains, this is what it looked like, looking back towards the west. And here, this is kind of a parenthesis for those of you who are not skiers. On a journey like this, you have to be able to ski uphill. Lots of my skiing was over flat ground or uphill, and only occasionally downhill. And you can ski uphill thanks to these things that are called climbing skins. To simplify, they're basically these sort of strips of fabric that adhere to the bases of your skis, and they enable you to kind of inch up a mountain without sliding back downhill. And so thanks to them, I eventually was up in terrain that looked like this. And this meant crossing a lot of heavily snow-laden slopes. And you may know that this represents a danger of avalanche when you have a steep slope with a lot of snow on it. And sure enough, at one point, about 500 or 600 yards in front of me, an avalanche came sliding down this mountain. The whole side of this mountain collapsed and terrified me, of course, as you might expect. But I eventually did get past. And I'm just telling you a few of these sort of little anecdotes of adventure that happened along the way. Now, one of the challenges for me was actually finding a way to move across the landscape in a way that was reasonably fast, because I had a lot of miles to cover, and I wasn't going to be bushwhacking through forest for hundreds and hundreds of miles. But there isn't a lot of recreation in this area, and so I had to sort of find my own trails or surrogates for trails, and that meant all kinds of things. Sometimes I found recreational trails. Sometimes I used the railroad, which sounds kind of funny to people in the Northeast because our railroads are these busy corridors, but these are cargo railroads that have very little traffic on them. Sometimes trains don't come by for days at a time. As I got farther east into places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, I found myself skiing on lakes for weeks on end, and some of these lakes were very big lakes, and it was just kind of me out there heading across towards these vast horizons. But no matter how good a way of moving across the landscape I always found myself envying other creatures who were out there, and how much more gracefully they seemed to move across the landscapes, even down to this little mouse who left this rather beautiful track. I want to read a short passage from my book about this discovery of needing trails, because there was a part of me when I was in the comfort of my home, planning this journey, that thought I could just sort of strike out across this continent and not think too much about how I did it, like it was just a matter of going. But somewhere along the way, I discovered that I needed trails or something like trails, and so I do a bit of reflection in the book about trails, and trails become kind of a metaphor for the ways we find of moving through life. So although I'd come to rely on trails, I still believed in the value of simplicity and lightness. Perhaps one of the virtues underlying a simple kind of infrastructure like a trail is its impermanence, or rather its ability to impinge on the physical universe only when it is needed, and then to fade into a near invisibility. These are really two separate things. In one sense, a trail has a lightness to it, such that if it is not used for a long time, it will grow over or be snowed in and be swallowed up by the landscape. In the other sense, even when a trail is still used regularly, in the intervals between uses, whether they last hours or days or weeks, it has a way of blending into the background so that life around it can go on without distraction. But so many of our infrastructures, when they are unused and eventually abandoned, persist as scars that clutter the landscape, and perhaps by their presence in our mindscape detract from our ability to think in closer harmony with our natural environment. It is precisely this ability to promote such harmony that may be another motivating virtue of an infrastructure like a trail. Portage trails foster harmony insofar as they respond to the locomotive needs of the land's inhabitants by bringing out the potential of lakes to act as passageways without bringing harm to the lakes themselves. There's also a harmony that arises out of the creation and use of a winter trail, whether it's traveled over on snowshoes, skis, dog sleds, or even a snowmobile. Rather than move snow out of the way like some nuisance, as we do when we plow roads, the traveler on a winter trail adapts to float on top of it and, in the case of skis, even takes advantage of snow's slipperiness to move faster. In a sense, the migratory paths of birds, whales, and caribou are a kind of natural, built-in infrastructure. The same might be said of the Earth's valleys, mountain passes, rivers, and chains of lakes. The only technology required to make them usable is the ingenuity of the user, whose virtues are transience, mobility, flexibility, and the fact that the mind needs no storage space. Perhaps grace, a species of intelligence is the ability to recognize the most appropriate way of moving or not moving in any set of circumstances, paired with the skill requisite to act accordingly. I'll stop reading there in the interest of time. This is the Peace River. It was kind of a momentous moment, or an exciting moment for me, because the Peace River is a river that flows north into a few other rivers, but eventually all this water empties into the Arctic Ocean. And given the kind of northern theme of this journey, this thought of crossing water that was bound for the Arctic gave me a bit of a thrill. As I entered Alberta, I had to sometimes ski down out of the boreal forest that I was doing most of my skiing in onto these patches of northern prairie where I was exposed to this unrelenting wind that blows across the middle of the continent. And there were some very cold moments in the neighborhood of 40 below spent out in places like that. This is kind of an atmospheric picture from northern Alberta. There were about 7 hours of daylight in the middle of winter where I was, and at either end of the days there were these long periods of twilight, so this is what it looked like much of the time. It was like this sort of drawn-out sunset. This was my home on the trail, a tunnel tent. Spent a lot of time in here, obviously, and if you have any questions, again, afterwards about things like my tent or my equipment, you'll be more than welcome to ask them. Just another instance of a trail. Now here, we've come to the home of one of my favorite characters in the book, a gentleman who was of Ukrainian ancestry, but he was Canadian, and his friends called him the Cossack, and he was highly entertaining, and I don't have much time, but I kind of want to read a short passage about a moment I spent with this man. Don was very interested in how I was moving across the landscape, and he was eager to have me ski on the lakes of northern Saskatchewan rather than trying to follow trails or the old gravel roads like that. And he'd spent a lot of time out mushing dogs and things like that in the past. And I just want to read a quick description of him sort of getting excited about helping me to find a way across the landscape. So we're in Don's house, and he's climbing up to this loft where he has all this stuff stored. He was excited as he climbed up into his sleeping loft, and after digging through a few layers of cumulus, pulled out a 4-foot-long cardboard box. He threw it down to me and descended the ladder. The box was open at one end and was stuffed full of crumpled pieces of old paper. We stood in front of the stove, and Don began pulling out balls of paper and tossing them on the floor. Not this one either, he said, discarding sheet after sheet. They were topographical maps, 10s of them. To the untrained eye, they would all have looked the same. Each one covered a couple of 100 square miles of townless, lake-strewn granite earth, but before even seeing the names on each map, Don could understand almost instantly what it showed. He eventually found the maps he wanted, got down on his knees, and flattened them out on the floor. His eyes lit up, and his voice brightened as his fingers ran over them, skimming easily from lake to lake. The maps were old and yellow, but the basic shape of the land would be the same. Let me just run, I know we have to go, unfortunately, but let me just run through these last few slides. So this was the, my clicker is not going. All right, it's not working. Anyway, so I eventually got across these 4 provinces and, of course, wrote a book about the experience. And, oh, here we are, the last few slides. After leaving Don's, I headed out onto a chain of lakes, which carried me the rest of the way across my winter, and I ended in the central province of Manitoba. And I think at that point I need to draw down. But again, rooms 209 and 210, if you have any, if you'd like to talk and ask questions or just hear stories, I'd be happy to talk to you. Thanks very much.